What's going on, you guys, and welcome back to the channel. So in this video, we're going to be looking at asynchronous JavaScript. Now, this is rather different from the stuff I've covered before, but seeing as though most of my topics are around web development, it's only right to also do some JavaScript. So this is a topic that had me confused for quite some time. So the idea of writing asynchronous JavaScript, I'd seen it and I'd made use of it before, but without fully being able to understand what was going on. So in this, we're going to be covering three areas of asynchronous JavaScript, which are callbacks, promises, and async and await syntax. Now we'll start with callbacks and make our way to promises and then async await, as that's kind of like the historical order of how all three of these things came into being. So originally it started off with callbacks, I think back in 2016, and then there was the introduction of promises, so the concept around that. And then I think around 2018 we had async await syntax, which kind of builds off from where we left off with promises. So to begin with, I've just created a index.html file and added the source for callback.js and this file here. So you can go ahead and do that now if you want to follow along. Otherwise, you can just check out the GitHub repo. I'll put the link in the description below. So to begin with, let's first go over what a callback is. Now, a callback is basically a function that is passed as an argument into another function. This technique just allows us a function to call another function, and yeah, we'll see that now as we build our example. So let's start off with creating some list of orders. So an order that users create when ordering from a shop. So we'll say orders or an array, and we'll have an item which is, let's say, Harry Potter book, and we'll have the user be, let's say, Snape, and we'll just give this a background color just for a bit of decoration, and we'll just give this an Alice blue color. Okay, let's just add two more. We'll have this item as being the Godfather. User can be a Michael, and the background will just give it a beige. And then for our final item, let's just have bowl of fruit, and we'll say Mary, and the background for this, we'll just give it antique white. Okay, so we have our orders. Now let's go ahead and kind of mock the behavior of kind of requesting this from a database. So we'll say our function, so const get orders, just the arrow. You can of course just use something like function and then get orders like that, but I prefer using this. That's probably more modern syntax. So we won't get orders. Now, in order to mock it, we'll just set a timeout. So set timeout, and this takes in a callback, so a function as an argument with no arguments inside this callback function. We can do this, and similarly, you can always just do function like so as the callback, just without that. But yeah, just to kind of stick with modern standards, let's just go with this. We of course need to add in a wait time, so I'm just going to say half a second, so 500 milliseconds, and we'll say let list equals, say, empty quote, and let's loop over each of our orders. So we'll say orders dot for each. This takes in a callback, so we'll say order and index, and here we'll just append list with backtick, so not double quotes or singular quotes, but this backtick here that looks like that, and we'll say This is a list item. We'll just give it a style, and we can pass in our background color. So this will be in double quotes, background color, and we'll set that to order dot background. And then in here, we can just pass in the order itself. So order dot item. And then finally, let's just add it to our document body. So we'll just say document dot body dot inner HTML, and this will be list. Cool. So that's our get orders, and we've added this set timeout just to kind of mock it, kind of making a request to a database, getting it back, and in our case, it's taking half a second. So let's call this. We'll say get orders, and let's open up our index.html. Now, one thing to mention, I have this extension called Live Server, which I use. It allows me to just open up the index.html file with a click of a button. So if I go to index.html and then down here, where you can see, maybe, why is it not showing up? I can just, or maybe if I just right click on this, if I right click on the index.html file, I can open up with Live Server. If I click on that, then I also, actually it should open automatically, but I have another browser open up here. But if I go to localhost and then port 5500, I now have my page. So what we can do is go back here and just close that. But yeah, it's one extension that I find really useful. In our case, you could just open up the index.html page, file itself. But yeah, why not just do it with a click of a button? Cool, so we have our get orders function, so our function here, and we've made use of some callbacks, but we haven't actually written our own. We're just using set timeout. So let's actually do it ourselves. So let's go ahead and create another function that will add an order to our list. So we'll say create order. We'll pass in a new order, and we'll just leave it at that for now. And then we'll set timeout again, just to mock. And what we'll do is say orders dot push, and we'll push on the new order like so. And then we'll set a timeout of, let's say, 1 second. Now let's actually call that. So create order. We can head back. Let's actually open up the command line, and I just want to see how you guys are seeing this, because I think it's a bit too small. Cool. So if we go over to the console, we're getting no issues. And what we're actually calling this create order, and we actually haven't passed anything in. So let's pass something in. We'll say the item is, let's say chocolate cake. We'll say the user is Larry. We'll give it a background color of, let's say, do something a bit blanched almond, like so. This should be background color. Should I set it as background, or okay, just background? Cool. So if we go back and we just refresh, nothing's actually happening. So, after a second, it should have showed up by now. It's been over a second. We're just getting back our list. And so, like, what's actually going on? So we call get orders. We then call create order, and all that's really doing is just pushing this or just adding a new element to our list of orders and doesn't do anything else. I mean, we're not actually calling it back. Maybe if we called get orders now and then refresh, yep, nothing's happening because I don't think this is actually adding it into it itself. So what do? Let's now pass in a callback. So we can say callback, and I mean, you can actually name this whatever you want, but I think typically it's usually called callback. And then down below, we can say callback, just like that. And then here inside create order, we can pass in the callback that we wish, and we'll say get orders. And this is without the parentheses. Let's head back. And now we get chocolate cake. So if I would just refresh again, you'll see there's a delay of 1 second, and then we get chocolate cake. So what's happening? Okay, so we understand with our get orders, we're just calling a list of our orders, but inside our create order, we first push our new order onto orders, and then there's this callback call that we're making. I mean, we could actually name this whatever you want, so we could actually just call this whatever, and then we could say just whatever like that. It'd do the same thing. But yeah, callback is usually the typical approach. All right, so then it adds this new order onto orders and then calls back whatever you pass here. And in our case, it's get orders. So this is then just replaced with get orders, like so. And that's essentially what a callback is. So it's just calling another function within inside a function. You pass it in as an argument. Okay, so that's so here we have callbacks. It's very common in JavaScript to make use of that or make use of callbacks. In the next section now, we'll look at promises. So I'm going to create a new file and call this promises.js. Now I also need to make sure I replace this with promises. Okay, so for promises, what is a promise? A promise takes two things. It has a producing code and it has a consuming code. And the producing code is code that that can take some time. So we want something to, so we know that, okay, executing this code will take some time. And then the consuming code is a code that must wait for the result that comes back from the producing code. Sounds very confusing. But essentially what it does is we give it two arguments, something that will happen when this function succeeds and something that will happen if this function were to fail. And let's actually code, as me just blabbing on doesn't actually help. So let's go ahead and create again some items. So we'll say in this case items, and we'll add in apples, bananas, and pears. Okay, so we'll say get, we'll just create a function called get items. And what this will do, we'll just do another set timeout, so then callback. And in this, we'll say let's item list, and then items dot for each. Say item, we don't really need the index, so we can just ignore that. So item, and then items list, and then just append, similar to what we did with the last section on callbacks. We'll just pass in item, like so. Cool, and then let's just do document.inner or body.inner HTML and set that to item list. Okay, and then let's just add a delay of, let's say, half a second. Let's actually go ahead and call that, so get items, and if we head back, we just get apples, bananas, and pears. Okay, so Again, we're not doing anything special. It's very similar to what we did at the beginning of callbacks. But let's actually go ahead and do something when it comes to adding creating or adding a item to our list. So how would that look like? Or what would that look like? So let's go ahead and say const, and then we'll say add item, and we'll give this an item. We're not going to be passing it a callback. Okay, so what should we do? Well, first, in order to actually create a promise, you say return new and then promise, or new promise to create a promise. And this takes a callback, and this callback has two arguments. We have the resolve and we have the reject. Okay, so what is resolve and what is reject? Both of these are pretty much, they're functions, and they are called depending on two things. So resolve is called when everything has worked out fine. Reject is called when something's messed up. So we'll do something like this. We'll say the kind of scope for our add item, we cannot add duplicate items. So we cannot add, let's say, apples again, or bananas or pears, as we already have them in our list. Okay, so this will allow for some error checking. So we'll say set timeout, again, just to kind of mimic the database, or us kind of calling something to a database. And we'll set this to second again. And we'll say something like this: if the items dot include or includes the item, then what we want to do is actually just reject it. So we'll say something like with backticks, item already in the list, something like that. So that's our reject. So because we don't want to add anything, or we don't want to add a duplicate item to our list. The next is, okay, that's if it's messed up, or if there's an error. The next is to actually do something. So if everything succeeds, if we're not adding something that already exists, then we want to add that to the list. We'll say items dot push, and we'll just pass in the item that we pass in the argument. And then finally, just resolve. So call the resolve function, and we specify all that in a second. Okay, so that's our add item, and let's go ahead and try this out. So what do we have? We know we have apples, bananas, and pears. Let's go ahead and call it. So we'll say add item, and then we'll add something like oranges. As we know that's not in there, so we should expect that to succeed. After this, then we use this dot then. So that's if it's resolved. So that's if something's worked out the way we want it to work out. If it does work out, then we want to call get items. Oops. Get items, like so. That's if it works out. So we can go back, and if I refresh, we have apples, bananas, pears, and then after half a second, we saw oranges appear. Okay, so that's for when it succeeds. Let's actually try it out now if we were to pass in something that already belongs in there. So we'll say pears. We actually don't get anything, but over here we see that we get a warning, uncaught in promise, pears already in the list. And that's just this message that we wrote here. Okay, so we know that there is some error. So what we can do is then actually deal with it. And actually to deal with a reject or an error, we can just say catch. And this takes in a function or a callback. And we can just say, for now, something like alert, and then error. Actually, let's just call this error. Okay, so let's actually refresh this. And we get pears already in list as an alert. Okay. Now if we try again with oranges, we just get back oranges and no error. So that's promises. And this is how you can actually create a promise by saying return new, and then promise takes two arguments, resolve and reject. Set timeout, And yeah, this is our case. Cool, so that's this, and then the next part is to actually go over async.js, or async await. I'm going to call the file async.js, and before I forget, here we'll say async.js. Now, async await, the async await syntax is it just makes writing promises much more pleasant and much more easier to look at, and yeah, you don't have to deal with the .then and .catch, and that's one of the great features of that. So let's go back to promises, and let's just copy all of this and paste it in here. Okay, so we have our items, we have our get items, and we have our add item. Now with async await, we don't need to do all this, and that's the great thing about it. So I'm just going to delete that, and also just delete that for now. And in order to make use of it, let's create a function, and we'll say something like async call. So our async function, and then like that. The only difference is that when you're creating an asynchronous function, you have to specify async here just before the arguments brackets, and that basically tells JavaScript, okay, this is asynchronous. Now in here, we can do something like await and then add item, and we'll pass in something like oranges, and that's it. And then we can actually go ahead and call it. So we can say async call, like so. If we go back, refresh, and did I add this in right? Yep, so we actually need to get our items as well. So get items in order to show it. Okay, so we're adding our oranges that we've done here. So okay, let's do pairs now. So we know pairs is something that we cannot add because we had this little checker in here. If we go back, we refresh, nothing shows up, and we also get a similar error to what we saw earlier, which is uncaught in promise. Pairs already exist in the console. So how do we deal with errors or the rejects with async? Because I've already said that we're not going to be looking or using the .then and .catch. So how do we do this with async await? Now, to do that, we just need to kind of wrap this inside try. And so what this will do is say, okay, await, add item, just as we had before. So try this out, and we'll pass in pairs, so something that we're not allowed to do, and then get items. And then if there is an error, we want to catch that error, just like this. So error, and then console, let's actually just do an alert again, like so. Okay, let's go back. And if we just refresh, we already got the error, but we see pairs already in the list. Click OK. So that's the way to handle a reject or handle the resolve reject using async await. It's much more pleasant on the eyes, as we're seeing like the try and then catch. We're not doing the .then and then .catch. And a lot of the times with promises, if you are using the .then and .catch, it can go on for quite some time, especially if you're using something like Mongoose. Then yeah, it just piles on and piles on. With this, it's just you wrap stuff inside a try and catch, and you deal with the error inside the catch block. Okay, so that's really async. It's also very popular to use promises or async await with the fetch statement, so making a request to an API. We can actually try this out by let's create a new function called get to dos. Say async. Yeah. So we can actually go over to this website. It's called JSON and then placeholder. And here we can go down and see some free kind of test APIs that we can use. I'm going to use /todos. Let's copy that and then just use it here. So we'll do a try and catch. Okay, so we'll say our response. So response equals await and then fetch. And then we can just paste in, oops, our URL or our endpoint. So that's actually fetching the data. The next thing is we want to do we want to convert that data into JSON. So we can say const and then data equals await and then response.json. So from this, you're probably thinking, okay, why are we using two awaits? The weird thing with fetch is that you have to do two .thens. So the first one is to kind of convert it into JSON, and then the rest is to deal with it as JSON data. So that's why we're doing two here. And then finally, we can just say something like let to do list equal double quotes, and then we can say data dot for each, as it's a list. We can pass in the item, and then here we'll just do something done before. So we'll just add in backticks, and then we'll say item.title, as that's what's here. If I just zoom in a bit, we have the title, and that's what we want. And then what we can do is just add this to document.body.inner HTML. We'll set that to to-do list. And then let's deal with an error. So we'll say console.error and then just the error. Oops. You can actually just put that in alert as well. Cool. So let's actually call this now. Let's say get to do's. I go back. And now we get a whole list, and for some reason, yeah, because I need to stop calling that. And now we get back our list with no errors at all. But if there was an error, then yeah, maybe there'd be an error if I didn't use that. So we're getting this reference error, data is not defined, because I just commented out this response.json. If I go back and it just refresh it, or if I refresh, then yeah, no errors. And the error is just dealt with in this catch. Much more easier to look at and deal with rather than having to use .then and .catch a certain amount of times. But yeah, overall, that's pretty much it when it comes to callbacks, promises, async await, or asynchronous JavaScript. Hopefully this gave you some insight into how this all works and how you can go about implementing it yourself. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you in a future one.